Evolution of the Entrepreneur is where we left off last time, and people loved it. We got so much feedback, so many people who really resonated with that, especially in our high-end containers, like the accelerator, my personal one-to-one clients, they all found it really spot on for where they are, which makes sense because they are the muse, you know?
Yeah, I was shocked. You and I have recorded a lot of podcasts together, mainly over on MVP. And we get every once in a while someone that reaches out and is like, that really connected or that was really helpful. Your podcast is gold. People love the MVP Mobile Bev Pros podcast, but never have we seen so many people go so far out of their way to share how impactful the last episode was. And that feels like we're onto something, right? And so in business, you kind of just start by throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks. And it really looks like this messaging around the evolution of an entrepreneur, but more specifically, I think our zone of genius in helping people transition out of using their time or their labor to make money to using their mind and their mouth, right? What they know and how they communicate to make money. And we're really well suited for that because we live in that realm. Earlier, we were talking back and forth, and you made me chuckle when you mentioned that like your current work, both with Mobile Bev Pros and your own personal coaching clients, there's no physical labor in it whatsoever. And same, like I've literally had to start hiring a personal trainer because the body is a temple and it needs attention. But I make all my money just being me and just pulling forth kind of what I know and sharing that with others. And I think a lot of people would love that reality. So we have medicine for them.
Alan Watts calls this getting paid to play, right? And that's exactly the next realm. It's also about elevating to the seat of the leader. I mean, if you've worked with me, you've heard this gospel many times. You have to be self-led first, right? And a lot of people who are at this point in the entrepreneurial journey, they have figured out how to make good money doing physical labor, but they recognize that, again, it's a locked box. They only have so many hours in a day. They can only lug so much ice. And so at that point, they have to start considering delegation and leadership so that they can expand their business. You can't be at every event or whatever it is that you do, even if you work in the online space. At some point, you don't need to be the one creating all the assets. You don't need to be the one editing your own podcasts or writing your own blogs, right? And so that requires leadership skills. And for me, the number one rule to leadership is that how you lead others is how you lead yourself. And if you've never self-initiated into leadership for yourself, then you're going to be a really terrible leader on the outside. And so that has to come first, right? And that's just another little tidbit there. But you have some tangible steps of like what's next for people, right? You're in this space, you're in a locked box, you recognize that it's time to move on. What are some next steps?
And this comes back to sacrifice, right? So what are you willing to sacrifice? What are you willing to stop doing? What are you willing to start doing? And if you start doing almost every time we get an entrepreneur that wants to start doing a new thing, there's no more space. There's no capacity. We see these business owners who just add on another business, right? Every time you do that, you dilute your potency. And so, yeah, you might be doing a thing and you're like, I'll just start another thing. Great. You can do that, but you're diluting your potency in both places. And maybe that's the sacrifice that you make is you just have to recognize I will no longer be able to show up in the same way for that business, that line of business, if I'm splitting that time and attention with this other business. And that's the sacrifice. I just recognize that I will not be able to give my all to this business any longer because now I'm running two lines of business. The same way with children. You have a second child and it's no longer just you with mommy, right? Now I gotta go take care of the baby. My attention is split. Now that's not to say that's not possible or doable. And like there's value in not being the center of attention all the time, especially since that's how the world works. You're never really the center of attention all the time. So like there's lessons in that too. So being an entrepreneur with multiple lines of business will have lessons for you that are not necessarily like detrimental, right? There's things to be taken away from that, but there will be sacrifice, whether you big death one of your businesses or whether you little death because now you're splitting your attention and you're having to focus on visibility for both and operations for both and marketing for both and sales for both. Like you're just having to do twice as much. Something is going to have to give. Where I see this happen the most often is the thing that is sacrificed is the physical body. I bring that awareness as a cautionary tale because 2 times already on the podcast, we've said that the physical vessel is our temple, right? And so we can't sacrifice the physical body forever or ideally at all. But sometimes that happens. I just did a 16-hour drive from New York back to Tennessee, and I sacrificed sleep. Not just that night, but the next day I was done energetically. I was just like tired. I stayed in my bed and read most of the day because I made that sacrifice, right? And so we have to realize that when we choose to sacrifice something, it's very easy to sacrifice health. Maybe I don't eat as well. I eat more, convenience foods. Maybe I don't sleep as much because I'll sleep when I'm dead. Maybe we don't move our body because we're trying to spin up this business that's mind and mouth. Like you don't really have to move your body very much, but try not to do that. So try not to sacrifice physical health when we make this transition. But the next thing that we want to do that's a tangible and strategic step is after we decide what we're sacrificing in order to make space for this new thing is sit with yourself, because you have learned a lot about yourself getting here, wherever it is, where you're starting to feel that friction and you're like, something needs to change. I'm out of alignment with my values here, or I'm out of alignment with where I see myself being in the future or what I want to do. And what lit me up that started this business that I have isn't what's lighting me up anymore. That's because you learned a thing. You grew. Maybe you learned many things. You grew and you realized, like, I want to be doing more of this and less of this. Totally fine. But we really have to look and sit. Like, what are the things, if I'm going to recreate this wheel, if I'm going to do a new thing, if I'm going to, small death this or big death this, and I'm going to spend more time and energy over here, what about me am I going to be more of? Or do you want to do more speaking? Do you want to do more writing? Do you want to do a podcast? How are you serving over there that is going to allow you to become more of yourself, who you already are? How are you offering what you are and who you are to the people that's more in alignment than this other thing over here? And that requires some real self-reflection.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I want to say. I want to touch back on sacrifice, but first I want to loop in that I had a discovery call today with a potential soul that wants support. And he mentioned that his back is against the wall. If he wants to create more cash flow, he has to get busier. And he has this passion and desire for a different avenue. But when he's looking at what's in front of him, that's what's paying the bills. And so it can be really scary to decide to sacrifice time and attention on that thing in order to pursue what's most aligned now. If I'm not mistaken, he started this business 5 or 6 years ago. He's been in it for a hot minute, but it no longer lights him up. It's not what he loves. In fact, he mentioned that he's resentful, right? Every time somebody books with him, he's like, I hate this. And then all the steps he has to take to make it work, he's like, I hate this. And you had kind of gotten there as well with your mobile bar when we were doing the work of getting you more integrated into MVP, that pivot point of going from lugging ice to having an impact. Because it's not just about that you're using your mind and your mouth now, your communication skills, your leadership skills, etc., your knowledge. It's also about, like, this new thing has more impact. I have more soul in this next level of business. And that's natural, right? Because you're going from something that's tangible, physical labor, to something that is more, you could say, spiritual, because you're elevating, you're going to a thing that's less tangible to create more impact. The other thing that I wanted to say was around sacrifice, because that word gets a bad rep. People hear sacrifice and they're like, no, no, no. Sacrifice feels like lack. Like I have to give something up. Or like if you're like me and you study in the metaphysical, you immediately see like headless chickens. You know what I mean? Like firstborn sons gone. Like sacrifice historically has been made like a very taboo topic. But actually, the word sacrifice is rooted in the same word as sacred, and it means to make sacred. And so, whatever you're sacrificing for, you are making that thing sacred. And so, yes, you might have to sacrifice time spent at your desk to be fully aligned and in honor of the body vehicle, of the temple. So, through that sacrifice, you are making the body sacred. Maybe you sacrifice an old business model for a new business model. By doing that, you are making the new business model sacred. Now, sacredness is a powerful magic because it calls on your intention, it calls on your attention, it calls on your value systems, it calls you to be in higher alignment with your true self, with your self expression. It calls you to be authentic. And so we want to make things sacred. And if you can start reframing, okay, I have to let this go so this other thing can be made sacred, as opposed to thinking I'm losing something, then the practice of sacrifice for you is going to become a powerful practice and not a burden. The other thing I want to say about sacrifice is that you're doing it all the time. So, first of all, you can either practice sacrifice consciously or you're practicing it unconsciously. The problem with practicing it unconsciously is that it is dominating you, right? You're like a victim to it. You're like being blown around in the wind by sacrifice. When you start practicing it consciously, then everything you decide to make sacred holds more gravity, value in your world, right? Because I intentionally made this sacrifice. And so when you're like, oh, Dawn, how am I practicing sacrificial magic all the time? That sounds crazy. If you woke up this morning and chose coffee instead of water, you made a sacrifice. If you woke up at 5 a.m. instead of 4 a.m., you made a sacrifice. If you woke up and took the dog for a walk instead of meditating, you made a sacrifice. But also the other way around. If you woke up and meditated instead of taking the dog for a walk, you made a sacrifice. You have to sacrifice either way. Any time spent doing this thing is time you're not spending doing that thing. And if you watch TV, you're sacrificing reading a book or whatever else. And actually, you're sacrificing every other possibility, which is why it makes it so sacred. Whatever you're doing is so sacred because all the potential that was stored in every possible reality is now being collapsed into a moment where you made a choice to lay in the bed and read a book.
There's so much here that I want to unpack. The first on the sacrifice, that's where radical ownership comes in. And I actually read your blog post on Donald Christian, and you bring this up. And I love that you do, because for, the very first step in anything for me is handing back someone's power card, because there's so many ways that we're giving up our power card in every given situation. And it almost always starts with taking radical ownership, which is why in this process of becoming evolved entrepreneur, it's what do you want to sacrifice? And then becoming aware of who you are, what drives you. That's the taking radical ownership of whatever I create next. And you can't go and do anything that's in alignment until you have an understanding of, to your point, what do you hold sacred? And when I first came to you, my goal with my work with you was to become more integrated. And you brought that up, the integrating my desires for MVP. MVP just happened to be what was next for me. I could have burned down both MVP and Bar Magnolia and done something completely different if that was what was on the path when I integrated. It just so happens that MVP was holding in integrity things that I valued. And so it made sense for me to kind of just roll into MVP and lean in a little bit harder there. Whereas I had become unaligned with many of the bits and pieces of Bar Magnolia because when I built it, I was out of alignment. And I think that's important for people to recognize that I built Bar Magnolia from a place of scarcity. So I was looking around at a lot of other people and taking bits and pieces of what worked for them. And so it stopped working for me because it was never built with me at the core. I mean, and it became a business and is still a very successful business, and someone is running it that isn't me. And like, it is its own entity, it's doing just fine, but it was no longer in alignment with my value set because I had decided to hold different things sacred than what Bar Magnolia was holding sacred. And so I had to sacrifice Bar Magnolia to become more integrated for me and who I wanted to be. And you had mentioned impact. Now, impact is a personal value of mine. I don't know if everybody's going to be driven by impact, but it was very clear to me that my impact with Bar Magnolia was small. And my impact potential with Mobile Bev Pros was much higher. And I think my impact potential with Crowns and Chaos is much higher than even that of Mobile Bev Pros. And so for me, I'm always internally seeking, how can I make the biggest impact on the world with my medicine? And so that's a personal value. And so if you're listening to this and you're like, I don't know, impact isn't really all that valuable to me, that's cool. That's a personal value. I hold that sacred. So I sacrifice things in the name of impact, right? The other thing I wanted to mention about holding sacred is that, and you already brought up the point about people associate sacrifice with losing out, but they also, I think, associate it with missing out on something. And so this fear of missing out, this FOMO thing, and this is, again, if you're not taking radical ownership for your choices, you might feel FOMO. If you don't own the fact that you're choosing to read a book instead of watching TV, and like that's a choice that you feel comfortable with, you might regret, man, I read this book yesterday, but really what I really should have done is watch this show, right? Like you might have this internal warfare about everything you do. And we actually know people like this that have intense amount of FOMO. No matter what they've decided, they're always longing for the other thing that they didn't choose, whether it's, a relationship they didn't choose, or a car they didn't buy, or, whatever it is. And the remedy for that is taking radical ownership for the things that you hold sacred. And so there's another piece here that wants to come through, and I don't know why, but it is something that was really important and impactful for me. So as someone who is a very driven person, and as someone who really only competes with myself, I don't run marathons, although I am a runner. People have asked, like, do you do like triathlon? No, I don't want to compete with anyone. The only person that I compete with is me. And oftentimes when I'm running, it's just to finish whatever it is that I've decided I'm going to run. And I have, for a long time, been building my business and building my life to achieve big things. Every house I bought is a little bit bigger than the last. It's in a little bit nicer of an area. Every car I've bought is a little bit nicer than the last one. Every purse I've purchased is a little bit nicer than the last one, right? So I see progress in my field. One of the most powerful things that I've realized, especially around my house, and I've talked to you about this before, is that we bought a house that's in an amazing area and I absolutely love it, but I don't really love the house itself wasn't really built in a way that I find very usable. There's a lot of unused space. It's a very big house. It's like 3,400 square feet, but I actually loved the usability of my 1,200 square foot apartment more than this house because there's just so much unutilized space. And so I'm like, I got to fix it. I got to hire someone and renovate it and make it perfect. There was a moment in time this year where I realized, for what? What am I holding sacred by constantly striving for perfection in my house, for constantly striving for driving the newest car, for constantly needing to keep up with the Joneses? What am I holding sacred by spending that money, that time, that energy to do those things? And what I realized is I actually love my house. And it's quirky and a little weird. There's like bricks around in the bathtub and the guest shower. And that's like totally strange, but it's character, right? And like, yeah, there's a lot of open space, but I can also do cartwheels down the hall. My girls can literally ride their bikes in our dining room and kitchen because there's just so much open space. Like, it's quirky, it's weird, it's not perfect, but it's ours. The reason I wanted to tell that story, I think, ultimately, is because sometimes it's not about changing or striving or accomplishing a new thing. It's literally about realizing that what you have is already fulfilling, that what you have already created is perfect. It's the perspective that is not perfect. It's this thing that you feel like you need to be achieving more in order for someone to think a certain thing about you, or that you need to have a house a certain way in order to invite people over. And like, that's all of these are stories that you're telling yourself, and you can choose to stop telling these stories. And what I sacrificed for that was the version of me that cared about those things. It was the version of me that insisted, in order for me to have a house that I was comfortable in and that I felt like, proud of, that it had to, have the vaulted ceilings and the modern farmhouse appearance and all of these other things that you see on social media or you see in the newer houses that are being built, like the little copy and paste new builds that you see. And that's all that had to be sacrificed, was the version of me that thought that that was important and necessary. And so I hope whoever's listening here recognizes that there may be absolutely nowhere to go or anything to do in order to achieve a more integrated version of who you are and a more aligned version of who you are. You may already be there. It's just the sacrifice of a story that will get you to that alignment.
Before enlightenment, sweep the floors, do the dishes. After enlightenment, sweep the floors and do the dishes. Sometimes you just have to sacrifice a perspective. Now, how do you know when to do one or the other? And this is where, all the way back to episode 1, and you mentioned it here, know thyself, right? When you don't know what your values are, when you've never spent time putting pen to paper or even voice recording and playing it back to listen to yourself, if you've never spent time with the self that was intentional around knowing who you are, then you're going to be lost no matter where you go. Everywhere you go is going to feel like you aren't home. On the flip side of that, you can do the work of getting to know yourself, and there's a peace and a calm and a serenity that comes with that. There's still chaos. Shit's still going to happen. The world's still going to be on fire, but you're going to be at home everywhere you go. Whether you're in a fire or you're by the fire, you're going to be at home, right? And so I love that you mentioned that sometimes the sacrifice required is simply the perspective. I think that's beautiful. The other thing that came up while you were talking was sacrificing for values. And I just want to be clear here that you and I will do podcasts on shadow alchemy and the 4 pillars of the self. One of those pillars is value. Okay. And actually, I'll give them all to you. The next pillar is vision. The next pillar is action. And the final pillar is trust. Okay. And we'll be doing episodes on that moving forward. However, today I want to touch on the value pillar, because when you sacrifice your values for X, Y, and Z, whether that's to your point, keeping up with the Joneses, how does your house look, right? You're sacrificing time, energy, resources for a false idea of success just so it looks nice. You're eroding integrity. We call this, in that pillar, we call this the shadow aspect of the value pillar. Her name is the prostitute. And she is willing to sacrifice all of her values for approval or money. Just sit with that for a second. The flip side of that pillar is the lover. And the lover is willing to sacrifice anything to remain in alignment with her values. She'll sacrifice money, approval, resources, time, energy, whatever it is. She'll sacrifice it in order to be in alignment with her values. And that's where we want people, because that creates a strong, solid foundation for the following pillars to be built. Because entrepreneur forces you through a level of personal development. And so if you're 2, 3, 4, 5 years into entrepreneurial venture, you are not at all the same person. Of course, you're the same person at your core, but you're not at all the same person that you were when you started this business. To your point, you started out of scarcity, and Mobile Bev Pros didn't hold that energy for you anymore. And you didn't want to hold that energy anymore. And so you had to let Bar Magnolia go and do her thing. So whatever reason you built, whatever it is that you have now, that why is probably pretty faded. And now it's time for a new why. And you're probably already feeling that. That's why you're still, 20 minutes into this episode now. That's why you're still listening to us. There's a new why that wants to be birthed. And that can be absolutely terrifying. But also, I can tell you that when you sacrifice for your values, the rewards that you reap are far greater and far more fulfilling than when you sacrifice your values for cash flow, for what's comfortable, for what you've always done, for what's currently putting food on the table.
I'm very excited to talk about the pillars, and I love that you talked about value, vision, and you said action, which I translated to mission, because that's what we start every business with, is mission, vision, values. And what is the thing that we see people struggle the most with, Dawn, when they start a business, they get a container with us and we ask them, what's your mission, vision, values? It's like, right? Like they might have some loose idea of the mission, which they should, because that's why you started a business. It's what you're going to do. Like you said, action. Yeah. What actions are you taking in the world that are creating the need for a business? Right. So people oftentimes will get into it and they'll be like, mission. Okay. I don't necessarily have my mission statement really nailed down, which we like to be one sentence and have it be like super impactful and powerful. And, is it in alignment with my mission? Okay. That's something that our business can do. But when it comes to value and vision, people really struggle. And in this model that you shared with me, that is a model that we have probably have innately been implementing forever and always. Starts with value, moves into vision, then it's handed off to the warrior. So by the time we see people in phase 3 where they're taking action in their business, we're like, okay, well, what's your vision and values? They have no idea. Like we're already starting with a rocky foundation. It's not super solid, right? And so the more work that people can do in knowing themselves through that value piece and then that vision piece, the better we can work with the warrior, which is the mission driven piece of oneself.
Yeah, exactly that. The extremes of these pillars, they're shadow or light. And so if you're in prostitute, child, victim, saboteur, then you're operating in the shadow pillars. Everything you do, everything you create will be made on an unsturdy platform. You'll watch it crumble essentially, or it won't work for you. The alternative, the light archetypes are the lover, the sovereign, the warrior, and the magician. And most of the people that we work with are heavy in their saboteur, which is that internal voice that says, don't do anything scary. You're not good enough. How will you do that? What's your mom gonna think? What will your mom think? And then before you know it, whatever passion and fire was ignited in the lover pillar, the saboteurs just squandered it. You could never see success. You better stay where you are because you will not be able to replicate that. Right. So the saboteur moves out of fear. And actually, all the shadow archetypes are motivated by fear, which is a very restricting feeling in the body. And so, any sacrifice that you're making is unconscious. So, you're being willed by sacrifice in your life. That looks like I never get what I want. Nothing good ever happens to me, that type of thing. And you're probably feeling this as restriction in the body. You're probably neglecting the body temple. It's trying to talk to you, and you're like shoving it down with whatever caffeine, alcohol, cigarettes, dirty drama TV shows, whatever it is. Like you're suppressing this like fear escape that's trying to get out of you. And the solution to that is to move into the light archetypes. And when you move into the light archetypes, your potential for greatness is equal to your potential for failure. And so you have to be conscious that however deep you are into the shadows is however high you can go. I used to say to you, however high this thing goes is as low as this thing goes. People like to think that you make it to heaven and terrible shit doesn't happen anymore. And that's not true. That's not true. You just have a higher perspective, right? And so that's what we want for people. We want for people to move, to evolve in consciousness so that they can handle the pressure, the tension that's going to be applied to your new structure because it will be applied. And if you're in shadow, in your shadow archetypes, then you're going to crumble underneath that pressure. And we want you to be able to sustain that pressure. It has to be built on a strong foundation.
What this brings up for me is we have the lover. Let's start there because that's on our little seasonal wheel spiral. That's season 1, the lover, which the flip side of that is the prostitute. And the lover needs to be given permission to love whatever she loves. That's, I think, where the first restriction that we implement on ourselves. I'm not supposed to like doing that. That doesn't make me money, so I shouldn't do it. I shouldn't spend time doing that. Only productive things are worth anything. And that's the first time we start to tell the lover, like she or he, not allowed to love that. And then we go over to the sovereign. That's where we hand our power card away. The flip side of the sovereign is, well, we'll just let someone else handle it. The child is the shadow side of that. And then the warrior, the shadow of that is the victim. And so like nothing's ever your fault. It's always someone else. Maybe something happens to us and we're like, oh, well, the weather or the government or like whatever. In order to get out of the victim, we have to move into the warrior, like ignore all that. What are we going to do from here? And so I think what's important is to recognize that whatever resistance you have, that you're shoving it down, which we know is terrible to do. Just reading something scientifically that you can draw a direct correlation to being in resistance and cancer. Like your body does not want to be in resistance. It wants to be in a flow state, an allowance state. And it doesn't mean that you have to do everything that you think about, but forcing yourself not to think about a thing is bad for your body, literally bad for your body. And so when we are building a business, if we're in resistance to things, like the medicine for you in the next level of your business is behind what you're avoiding doing. That's resistance, right? If you're resisting something in your business actively, avoiding doing something, or you have a fear of a certain thing, chances are getting rid of that resistance is the thing that's going to take you to that next level. And so there's so many places within these archetypes that we start to, I'm seeing like handcuffs, hog ties in my brain, our business, but also ourselves when we insist on something looking a certain way. And with Bar Magnolia, I started doing that because I was like, well, these people are doing it this way. That's how I have to do it. This is how people price. That's how I have to do it. Now, I've since decided that's not how you do it. And I teach a very different model than a lot of people execute in that industry. In a lot of ways, I teach people how to price things different, message things different, all of that, because I no longer play by their rule book. I play by an internal rule book that is informed by things that I have learned. But when we talk about knowing thyself, a great place to start is to kind of look at these different archetypes. Like, what do you love that you're telling yourself you're not allowed to love? In what areas are you handing your power card away? In what areas are you not doing a thing and you're just letting other people tell you what to do, or it's always someone else's fault? And in what areas are you sabotaging yourself because you don't believe in the power of a leap of faith? And that's a really good place to start with know yourself. That if you want to know what the next step in your evolution as an entrepreneur is, you got to take it all the way back home.
Yeah, so we have at least 12 more podcasts on the books because as you were talking, of course, I want to talk about the Trinity, the Holy Trinity of magics, red, white, and black magic. And if you're listening to this and you're like, magic, yeah, listen, I describe magic as action based on values and vision that then imbues you with a sense of trust. That's all magic is. It's action inspired by your values, aligned with your values, inspired by and aligned with your vision, with your core vision. It's radical ownership and it's the trust that the universe has your back, the universal force. That can be God, that can be universal intelligence, like it could be any whatever you pray to. It's trust in that force, right? These are all very important principles when you're creating absolutely anything. And in the evolution of the entrepreneur, you go from a physical world to an energetic world. If you're going to use your mind and your mouth, your mind and your communication skills, your leadership skills to make money, you are now on the energetic path. And so it no longer matters that you show up and you're there for this many hours and you do this much physical labor. Now your mind's got to be behind it, right? First rule of Hermeticism, all is mental. You have to have the correct mindset and you have to be attuned to the energies at play to be able to craft something on the mental plane that far exceeds anything you could ever craft on the physical plane.
Yeah. So mission, vision, values. The mission is the what you're doing. The vision is the why you're doing it. And the values is the how you're doing it, right? So for me, a value is impact. So I'm going to focus on doing things that have a bigger impact. That's the how I'm going to show up in the world. And with the magician, which you are calling trust, I call surrender. And I like the word surrender here, although it's the same as trust, because there's a saying in Christianity that I love, and I feel like every Christian fails to understand it. And that is give it to God. So like they'll give it to God, but then they'll pray about it all the time and they'll think about it all the time and they'll ask the church to also pray for it and they'll toil over it. And I'm like, didn't you give it to God? Like what do we not trust God? Don't just trust it, surrender it to the magician, in this case God.
I have to say something on this because I think what happens there is they jump all the way, they skip the mission, vision, values. They skip lover, sovereign, warrior, and they go straight to give it to God. And when you go straight to the magician pillar, it's again on a faulty foundation. And so what happens in Christianity, we would give it to God and then we would constantly be like, okay, well, why isn't God giving it to me? I must be unworthy. Then they're in their prostitute, right? And then they're like, oh, I can't see clearly without the eyes of God. God, show me the way. And okay, well, now we're giving away our power card. We're in the child. Same with the warrior. They're not taking any action. They're simply walking by faith, but they're not actually walking at all. They're sitting at home on their knees, just praying. Naturally, it never comes to fruition. And if it comes to fruition, it crumbles quickly. And so when we say give it to God, we mean you do all you can. You have to do all the fucking work. You are God embodied, my friend. And so it's on you to do all the work. You have to clarify the values. You have to clarify the vision. You have to take the action required of you. And then you recognize that something far greater than you is keeping your heart beating and that you can only carry this vessel so far. You can eat as healthy as you want, but the second that whatever force that is says you no longer get to breathe, it's your time. All right. And so we want to do all the work on the front end with respect to the fact I can only carry it so far. Some greater power than me is driving this. And then we give it to God, but not a minute sooner.
With the recognition that when you surrender, you are completely unattached to what happens, right? You and I like to reference back to the maybe monk. That's not at all what it's called, but it's some wonderful parable where all sorts of things, both good and bad, happen to this monk. And he, at every turn, they're like, that's so amazing. He's like, maybe. And then like, that's terrible. He's like, maybe. Right. And that's true surrender. You can only do so much. What the impact is long term, you have to just completely unattach to it. So with business too, you're going to do your best to create a thing in the world. You're going to create a mission. This is what I want to do. You're going to have a vision. This is why it's important to me to do it. And then you're going to have values. This is how I'm going to do it. I'm going to show up in this way because of this thing. And this is what I'm going to do. Great. You may never achieve that thing. That's not the point. The point is that you wake up every day feeling fulfilled and alive because you're doing a thing that aligns with your values, that is working towards your vision, and is the thing that it is that you said you wanted to do. That's it. What impact it has, what happens in the long term, that's not on you because you can't control anything else. You can't control anything else about the world, about the environment, about the government, about the weather, like nothing, right? So that's where the surrender comes in, is just letting magic happen after you've done everything that you can. And so if you are an evolving entrepreneur and you're like, I get it, I'm not really all that comfortable with what I've created up until this point, chances are what you created was unconscious. This is the invitation, the opportunity for us to bring conscious awareness around your mission, vision, values, so that whatever comes next is aligned with who you are, what you're going to do, and how you're going to do it. And what a time to be alive.
We added another episode to the queue just now with the law of surrender or the law of acceptance, which has two branches that I like to call attachment magic and resistance magic. And that'll be a really fun episode as well, because that's another tool that I'm really in love with. It's a tool that you can wield and you'll start to see it happening all around you. You'll start to see it happening within yourself, and you'll know exactly the medicine for that as soon as it happens. This has been an awesome episode. I fucking love our podcasts, and Crowns and Chaos just has my whole heart right now. And we have a lot of podcasts in queue, and you're back from the lake in New York. And so I'm just going to hop on your schedule for the next 8 days and we'll just knock them all out. Bang, 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 bang. Because there's so much fun right now.
Amazing. Can't wait.